In April of 2010, Sega revealed a new and very unexpected Yakuza title. While many fans were waiting for news on a sequel to Yakuza 4, Sega would instead reveal a new spin-off of the series that would be developed for the PlayStation Portable. This new title would be called Kurohyou, Ryu ga Gotoku Shinshō, or as it roughly translates to in English, Black Panther Like a Dragon New Chapter. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful either way, I know. This game would still be set in the now iconic series setting of Kamurocho, but would feature an entirely new cast and explore a totally different side of the Tojo Clan, while still being set parallel to the mainline titles. This was a great idea, but unfortunately, Sega would decide that it wasn't worth spending the time or resources to localize the game, so as a result, Kurohyou would never see a release outside of Japan. Much like Kenzan though, that wasn't exactly going to stop me in my quest to play through every single Yakuza game, so I went ahead and imported a copy for us to take a look at. And thanks to some very dedicated members of the Yakuza community, a full English translation patch is available for this game. So even though I could have played through this game in Japanese, I used the fan translation since I figured it would be a lot nicer for you guys to have some footage that's in English so you can actually understand the text that's on the screen. Well, that, and it's just more convenient since I can read English like 3 times as fast as I can read Japanese, but that's besides the point. So is Kurohyou yet another Yakuza spin-off that deserved to be released outside of Japan, or was it another PSP spin-off of a beloved franchise that was forgotten for a reason? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 6th in a series of videos where I'm playing every game in the Yakuza series for the first time in release order and reviewing them as I go along. You don't have to have seen the first few videos in order to enjoy this one, but you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with those games and my thoughts on them if you haven't seen them. So for those that are interested, I'll have the full playlist in the description below if you want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Kurohyou Ryu ga Gotoku Shinshō is an action-adventure game developed by Sega CS3 and Sin Sophia and published by Sega for the PlayStation Portable in 2010. In Kurohyou, we play as Tatsuya Ukiyo, a 17-year-old high school dropout living in Kamurocho. At the beginning of the game, Tatsuya gets himself into a fight with a member of the Tojo Clan's Kuki family and ends up accidentally killing him. The next day, he's kidnapped by the patriarch of the Kuki family, who explains to him that the man he killed the day before was actually his right-hand man. He then reveals that they've brought Tatsuya to an underground fighting ring the Tojo Clan runs called Dragon Heat. Kuki then explains that he's been looking for a wild fighter like him to entertain his audience, and tells him that if he can win 10 fights in a row here at Dragon Heat, then they'll forget about him killing his right-hand man. But if he loses at any point during those 10 matches, they'll turn him over to the police, along with the video evidence of the murder. The central plot from this point on then revolves around these 10 fights, with each of the 10 main story chapters having the basic structure of introducing your next opponent, giving you some drama and opportunities to learn about said opponent, and then ending with you fighting them in the ring. And the writers clearly put a ton of effort into every single one of Tatsuya's opponents here, with each of them being either tied into his past somehow, or being a direct foil to his character. This allows each of these 10 matches to broaden Tatsuya's perspective and help him form a deeper understanding of his own philosophy, not just in fighting, but in life as a whole. It's really easy for stories like this to just rely on the basic, oh, the main character trains a whole lot and gets really strong so that they can win every fight, but they're always infinitely more interesting when you have the main character overcome the opponent through their beliefs and ideologies instead. It's really well done here too, and seeing Tatsuya go from a punk kid who just gets into fights with anyone he disagrees with to a young man who's found his purpose and what he truly believes in is really awesome. In fact, it's so awesome that it has me really hoping that he pops up in a mainline Yakuza game someday, because I feel like seeing him bump shoulders with Kiryu and the others would be pretty incredible. And it's a genuine possibility if the team over at RGG ever decide that they want to do it, because like I mentioned earlier, this game takes place parallel to the mainline games. It's not just some random side story, it's another story that is actually taking place in Kamurocho roughly around the same time that the events of Yakuza 4 are. As far as I could find, we don't know exactly if they overlap or how far apart they are, but both games take place in Kamurocho at some point in the year 2010. You'll even run into some familiar faces from the mainline entries here, so some of the side characters from the numbered titles have actually already met and interacted with Tatsuya. It'll probably never happen, but hey, a man can dream, right? Regardless, the story here is really good. It seems really straightforward and simple in the beginning, but as things start to really get moving, you'll quickly learn that there's a lot more depth here than the writers initially led you to believe. Beyond just Tatsuya's strong character development, there is of course a larger conspiracy going on in the background that we slowly come to discover as things progress, because it just really wouldn't be a Yakuza story without some unknown third party secretly planning everything from behind the scenes. It suffers a bit from your typical Yakuza story issues, with it getting pretty convoluted and having some poor pacing at times, but it's really solid overall, and I found that the characters were strong enough here to really carry it and help me look past those issues. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but as I'm sure you guys have already noticed, Kurohyou has a really unique presentation style. All of the game's cutscenes make use of this hand-drawn, manga-style artwork that's then animated slightly to add some motion to the scenes and just generally make them a little more interesting to watch. I'm sure this style is hit or miss for a lot of people, but for me, it's definitely a hit. The artwork is all really damn good, and action scenes feel surprisingly visceral here. I'm sure some would prefer more traditional cutscenes, but when the art is this well done, I can't really complain. And speaking of artwork, the game makes use of pre-rendered backgrounds while running around the district of Kamurocho. This of course means that those fixed camera angles that I loved so much in the PS2 games returns, and if you've seen any of my videos talking about the classic Resident Evil titles, you'll already know that I have quite the soft spot for pre-rendered backgrounds. This is probably a decision that was made to work around the limitations of the PSP, because while I'm sure that they could have rendered 3D environments along with all those character models, doing so would have been a pretty major drain on the PSP's battery. And once again, I'm not really going to complain that the limitations of the system led to a style that I really enjoy. Now, the character models in the open world might not be that great, I mean, even Tatsuya's model is pretty low poly, but the overall image is really pleasant to look at thanks to the way that the models pop off of those pre-rendered backgrounds. In combat though, the game doesn't have to render all of the other NPCs wandering around, so Tatsuya's model, as well as the models of the enemies you'll be facing, are of a noticeably higher quality while fighting. And speaking of the combat, it might just be the most interesting part of Kurohyou. See, for all intents and purposes, Kurohyou is a 3D fighting game. Rather than having a more loose and free-flowing combat system like every other game in the series, Kurohyou instead has a much more tight and tactical combat system. You still have your basic options of light attacks, heavy attacks, and grabs, except now instead of light attacks and heavy attacks, the square and triangle buttons have been changed to be punches and kicks respectively. They still feel very similar to light and heavy attacks, but that difference is very important for reasons that we'll come back to shortly. The quick-step move from previous games also returns here, but it too has been readjusted slightly to act more like a proper sidestep, akin to what you might see in games like Tekken or Virtua Fighter. And to incentivize players to sidestep enemy attacks, the developers have introduced a sort of perfect dodge mechanic where if you sidestep right as their attack is about to land, you'll get a cool slow motion sidestep followed by a big swing to the opponent's head. Even if you don't land that perfect sidestep though, the tracking on attacks has been reduced across the board here, so you can still use the sidestep to avoid taking damage. Additionally, most Yakuza games have a parry mechanic that can be learned during your playthrough, but Tatsuya has one available right from the start of the game, only further incentivizing players to adopt a more defensive playstyle here. And what's really cool is that the enemies in this game are completely capable of using the same defensive mechanics that you are. This means that all of your attacks are just as likely to get sidestepped or parried as any of the enemies are, which really pushes players to actually look for openings in the opponent's defense and capitalize on them instead of just spamming punches and kicks non-stop. So yeah, across the board, you have to play much more thoughtfully here than in any of the previous Yakuza games, and that's including Yakuza 3. But if that doesn't sound like your thing, I might be able to grab your interest again by telling you that Kurohyou introduces various fighting styles. Throughout the game, Tatsuya is given the opportunity to learn various forms of martial arts, and once you've learned how to use these styles, each of them will give Tatsuya a completely unique moveset and playstyle. You'll start the game with only the basic street brawling style available, but you're able to learn a grand total of 20 different styles throughout your playthrough. And the way that learning these is handled is actually pretty interesting. To start with, there are 6 basic styles that can be learned either as a part of the main story or by completing specific sub-stories in the open world. These are things like the aforementioned street fighting style, boxing, wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, all sorts of different stuff. Then, there are the 7 advanced styles that are learned through practicing and leveling up various combinations of those basic styles. So for example, leveling up both your street fighting and boxing styles will grant Tatsuya access to the Muay Thai style, or practicing your traditional martial arts as well as your karate will allow you to learn Chinese Kung Fu. Then after those, there are 6 of what the game calls extreme styles, which are MMA-esque combinations of multiple martial arts forms that Tatsuya develops through mastering multiple basic and advanced styles. My favorite example of these is the Extreme God Hand style, which, yes, it really is called that, and it's unlocked by mastering the boxing, Muay Thai, and Kung Fu styles. In mastering all 3 of these, Tatsuya becomes incredibly proficient at delivering powerful punches to his opponents, and thus develops this extreme fusion style of his own. And last but not least, there's one final style called Extreme Being that you can unlock by mastering all 6 of the available extreme styles. Unfortunately, I didn't grind enough during my playthrough to actually unlock Extreme Being, so I don't have any footage of my own to show you guys, but I thought it was worth a mention so that I could give you a full picture of how this progression actually works. These fighting styles add a ton of variety to the gameplay, not just through offering essentially 20 unique playstyles and movesets, but also just allowing every player's Tatsuya to be customized to their preference. I mean seriously, if you want your Tatsuya to be a total martial arts master by the end of the game, you can just go ahead and use traditional martial arts or Kung Fu. Or, if you're like me, you could pull up to the final boss fight and start throwing out your flashiest lucha moves to style on him as hard as possible. The styles add a shocking amount of player expression to what initially seems to be such a simple little PSP game, and they're probably the single coolest thing about the combat here. But you can't get too carried away messing around with all the unique combos and stuff, because there are still a couple more systems that are here to slow things down. The first of these is definitely the more straightforward one, with this being the fatigue system. Every time you do just about anything during a fight in this game, you'll build up a small bit of fatigue. Throwing punches, kicks, sidestepping, parrying, all of these things will tire Tatsuya out if you spam them too frequently. The more fatigue that Tatsuya builds up, the slower your combat animations will become, and if you build up too much, he'll have to completely stop fighting and take a rest for a second before being able to go back in. So once again, you just need to slow things down a bit and think carefully about what you do before you actually do it, since if you don't, you'll really exhaust Tatsuya and leave him completely open to attacks for a little bit. It may sound annoying to some of you, but trust me, this leads to some pretty intense games of footsies, especially with some of the bosses later on. The other system that's supposed to help with keeping things more intentional here is the injury system. Whenever you take damage in Kurohyou, it will not only be applied to your total health, but also to the part of your body that you actually got hit in. As your individual body parts take more damage, you'll be hit with certain debuffs, like head injuries causing you to become dizzy after taking hits to the head, or arm injuries allowing enemies to break through your guard more easily. This isn't just a debuff that's applicable to Tatsuya though, as much like everything else in the combat here, the injury system is also applicable to your enemies. So while they're capable of inflicting injuries on you, you're just as capable, if not more capable, of inflicting injuries on them. This adds a really cool level of strategy to the combat, and I found myself often playing a bit slower early on in my fights, but then if I could land something like a solid head injury, I would get more aggressive from that point on, as I would have a distinct advantage over my opponent. It's definitely one of those things that won't be for everyone, but I found myself really enjoying it, despite the fact that I thought it would be a little annoying when it was first introduced. And to close out this little section about the combat, it's definitely worth mentioning that this is easily the hardest Yakuza game I've played so far. I mean seriously, not many of the previous games were all that difficult aside from Kenzan or Yakuza 3, but Kurohyou is more than willing to challenge the player on even its normal difficulty. And while that might sound off-putting for some, I actually really enjoyed the challenge, because I would also say that Kurohyou has the most fair level of challenge from the series so far. The systems and mechanics of Kurohyou's combat system make for a game that, while challenging, is also incredibly rewarding to learn, since once you've got it down, you'll be able to avoid damage almost entirely and just style on your opponents. This also leads to Kurohyou having some of the most fun and satisfying bosses in the series so far by a mile. Like, it's seriously not even close. Each of them will take a new player at least a few tries to defeat, but it's not due to them cheating the system like the hardest bosses from previous games. Rather, it's because you'll need to learn how to approach each boss in order to work around their unique fighting styles. So if you're the kind of gamer that loves a good challenge as long as it's fair, Kurohyou is absolutely the Yakuza game for you. And luckily for me, I just so happen to be that exact kind of gamer. So yeah, overall, I absolutely adored Kurohyou's combat. I've never felt myself engage with the combat of the Yakuza games this deeply before, and I had also never felt so genuinely rewarded for learning the mechanics and the systems of these games either. It does take a bit of getting used to, especially if you're coming off of the more traditional Yakuza titles, but once you get it down, it's easily the most satisfying combat system the series has produced up to this point. But I'm sure those of you who haven't played the game for yourselves before are probably wondering how well they managed to translate the Yakuza open world experience to the PSP. And the answer to that would be that they did so shockingly well. So well, in fact, that if you've played any of the mainline games, you'll feel right at home with the open world formula here. You're still able to run around between main story missions and complete sub-stories, play mini-games, get into random battles, basically everything that you can do in the home console games. So getting into the specifics of it, the sub-stories here are fairly entertaining, but they've gone back to being incredibly simple. They feel much more like the sub-stories of the PS2 games in terms of both their length and content. And while those sub-stories were never necessarily bad, it's definitely a step down from the quality that we've seen in the PS3 games. And a lot of the iconic mini-games from previous Yakuza titles, like the batting cages or the karaoke game, return here, but unfortunately, they're pretty awful, actually. In an attempt to save on resources, the developers have opted to use interactive video files for the minigames here, rather than rendering them out in real time. The result of this is a substitution for the original minigames that, while functional, just don't feel anywhere near as smooth and enjoyable as even the minigames in the PS2 titles. I mean, really, even the UFO catcher here just feels seriously outdated and really unpolished. Despite using video files though, the bowling minigame somehow made it out unscathed. Like, seriously, I don't know how, but the bowling feels just as good to play here as it did in Yakuza 4, despite looking like, this. Thankfully though, there are a handful of new minigames on offer here, and all of these are actually a decent bit of fun. They mainly come in the form of part-time jobs that are available for Tatsuya, allowing players to earn some extra money by going and playing some of these new little minigames. These range from scooping ice cream at the local gelato shop, serving up meals at the Smile Burger, or keeping the crowd under control at the strip club. Which, by the way, the visual fidelity of the dancers on stage during the strip club minigame are hilarious when compared to the fidelity of literally anything else in the game. Same goes for the hostesses here too. They really didn't skimp on the quality when modeling and animating these ladies, and you know what? I can't really blame them. Jokes aside though, you'll probably need to spend a bit of time during your playthrough working these part-time jobs, because money is very important in this game. And beyond just being important, it's also intentionally more difficult to acquire in Kurohyou than in any of the other Yakuza games up to this point. And this is all because of Kurohyou's new approach to training at the dojo. See, while Tatsuya does have a martial arts master that he can go and train with, much like every other main character in the franchise to this point, this master's training is a little less conventional than others. Instead of going through various training exercises that will eventually grant you new techniques, you instead just have to go and pay your master a little money. By paying him money, you'll be able to increase your stats across one of 5 categories, with each of these doing things like increasing your punching damage, your kicking damage, or increasing Tatsuya's stamina so he gets fatigued less often. This is certainly a bit of an unorthodox approach to the training, but I honestly kind of like it. Sure, it's a little less polished than what we've seen in previous games, and by that I mean it's a lot less polished, but it gives money much more of a purpose here in Kurohyou. I mentioned this briefly during my Kenzan video, but in most of the Yakuza games so far, money hasn't really been all that important outside of just buying consumable items or other small things in the open world. But Kenzan had the swordsmithing system that allowed you to get better stats for your character through saving up and spending money, and that's basically what the dojo is here in Kurohyou. It gives you a tangible reason to care about earning money, and rewards you for saving up by permanently increasing your stats for the rest of the game. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a big win, even if it's a bit of a weird win. Part-time jobs aren't your only new money makers though, because there's also the addition of the Kamurocho Strongest Tournament. This is a tournament that's being held to try to find the strongest man in Kamurocho, and if you complete a certain sub-story during your playthrough, then Tatsuya can compete in it. There's a nice rankings leaderboard where you can keep up with how everyone is doing, and each fight will slowly push you higher and higher towards the number 1 spot. And as you can probably imagine, the higher you get on that leaderboard, the more tough your opponents are going to get. Each victory that you get in this tournament will also earn you a nice bit of extra cash, but the catch is that you also have to pay in a certain amount in order to fight each opponent in the first place, so if you lose the fight, you also lose your initial buy-in money. It's a simple little piece of content that allows you to have some fun and earn some extra money while engaging with it. But those of you who have seen my videos covering the Armored Core franchise will already know that this sort of content is exactly my thing. I don't know why, but I always tend to love stuff like this where I can fight against strong opponents and slowly climb towards the number 1 spot. And yes, I did end up taking the number 1 spot well before finishing the game. I just can't help what I am, man. I see a leaderboard like that, and I have to go for it. And as you run around the city going from point A to point B, you will of course still be met with random encounters where thugs try to beat you up so they can take some of your money or whatever it is they're trying to do. These have always been pretty hit or miss for me in the Yakuza games, and unfortunately, they're still pretty annoying here in Kurohyou. They actually seemed pretty great to me at first because they're really easy to run past early on thanks to the enemies running at you at really slow speeds, but that's where the developers play a little trick on you here. You see, with every single random battle that you skip, the guy initiating the next one will get just a little bit faster. So if you try to repeatedly skip random battles, these thugs will eventually just start running faster than Tatsuya can and will be literally impossible to escape. It's fine early on, but I ended up getting super over-leveled during my playthrough since I was spending so much time engaging with the side content of the game. So I obviously just wanted to run past these guys since I didn't need the experience or the money from defeating them. And when I say over-leveled, I mean that I was at the point where I had to sit through all of the dialogue and loading screens that these guys would bring with them, only to one-shot them as soon as the fight actually started, and then being able to move on with my day. So yeah, they can be super obnoxious to deal with as usual here, and this honestly might be the most annoying random battle system in the series so far. To add to that annoyance, Kurohyou also has police roaming the streets for the majority of the game, and these guys only add even more frustration to the process of exploring the city. If an officer manages to catch you while you're walking around, there won't be any real consequences, but it will cause Tatsuya to automatically run off to some random spot in the district, normally one that's pretty far away from where you get caught. So these guys essentially act as a sort of bouncer to slow your progress through the city and whatever it is that you might be doing, which I'm sure I don't need to explain to you why that's incredibly irritating. But to prevent the video from ending on a sour note, I did save one pleasant surprise for last. As you complete certain activities out in the open world, you'll occasionally be rewarded with an item that can be used to buff Tatsuya. This is nothing new to the series, but in previous games, these buff items would have to be equipped to one of a very limited number of slots. This would make it so that the amount of buff items you could have equipped was very limited, and prevented you from stacking a ton of them to completely break the game. Here in Kurohyou though, you'll gain the buff from these items simply by having them in your inventory. There aren't any limited slots here aside from just your general inventory space. So by the end of the game, not only was I over-leveled, but I was also running around with nearly a full inventory of buff items that were just stacking like 10 extra effects onto me at all times. You of course don't have to use this many buff items if you want to carry more healing items or whatever your reason might be, but for me, it only made the endgame more fun when I was stacking up as many buffs as possible, starting fights with full red heat and just going straight at enemies with the lucha style equipped. Overall though, if you couldn't tell already, I loved my time with Kurohyou. It has a simple yet effective story, some of the most enjoyable combat we've seen in the series so far, and some really solid open world content to boot. It's a shame that we never saw a release of this one outside of Japan, because much like Kenzan, this is a title that I absolutely feel would be one of the most beloved in the series if it was just a little easier to get your hands on. And that really surprised me, because coming into this one, I was expecting something along the lines of the Yakuza experience but slightly downgraded. But instead, I got what I would actually say is my favorite game of the series so far. Which is probably a really good thing, because I've heard a bit about the next Yakuza title we're gonna cover, and yeah, we'll just see how that goes. But at the end of the day, I'm going to give Kurohyou Ryu ga Gotoku Shinshō an 8.9. Hey guys, thanks for making it all the way through another video. If you enjoyed it, consider throwing a quick like or a sub my way to help out with that whole algorithm thing, because it's January, so I'm probably gonna need it. And just to get a little extra spicy with this one, consider sending it to a friend of yours that might enjoy it if you happen to know any big Yakuza fans. As always, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and YouTube memberships. You guys add some much needed stability to these long-running series, and I can't thank you enough for that. Anyway, I'm gonna let you guys go and get back to working on the next video. So thank you all again for watching, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.